We will continue to discuss issues of different disciplines contributing to key debates in higher education. Our speaker is James Faulconbridge. He's a professor at Lancaster University. Some of his key research interests are globalization and professional service firms, knowledge, learning and innovation practices, and mobility in everyday and business life. And some of the theoretical fields he's drawing on, it's economic geography, organization studies, and sociology. The discussant, the respondent to James' talk will be Aline Courtois. She's a research associate at the Center for Global Higher Education, working on a project which is concerned with the public good role of higher education. Some of her key research interests are sociology of education and elite education, internationalization of higher education and student mobility, and casualization of academic work of higher education. James will talk for about 40-45 minutes, then Aline will have 10 minutes, and we have about 10-15 minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I stand between you and lunch, so I apologise for that. I hope you've all stocked up on biscuits, because it's a late lunch, isn't it? I suppose it's better than being after lunch when you're all falling asleep. So I'm going to take the kind of the title, the objective of the seminar very literally, I suppose, in the sense of kind of perspectives from other disciplines. But perhaps in a slightly different way to what we've heard so far this morning, although I'm going to connect to, I think, a number of the debates and issues that have come up. So I don't, if I get my admissions in now, my kind of health warnings, I suppose, I don't actively research higher education, so shall I leave now? But what I'm doing, to take, as I say, taking it quite literally, is thinking about how the research I do on the professions broadly and professional services, how it might provide some interesting insights, points for debate, starting points for discussion that can be relevant to higher education. So slightly different to the panelists this morning who come from different disciplines but study higher education. I'm coming from a kind of slightly different space in that empirically I don't study higher education. So I apologise. Perhaps I will by the end. You can convince me I should convert. What I want to do is talk a little bit about my research and make some kind of risky propositions about things that we could learn or things we might ask about higher education and its globalisation based on the work I've done on the professions. And so provide kind of some intellectual food for thought before the real stuff about how there might be parallels to what's going on in other kind of contexts, how there might be interesting questions that have already been raised a little bit this morning that we could explore further by looking at different contexts. So as a kind of, my background, I'm another economic geographer. We're everywhere. We hide under various different guises. So I'm an economic geographer by training, but I actually now work in a management school, and you can ask me about that at lunchtime. So I kind of partly economic geographer, partly organisation studies, a bit of sociology in me as well. I am quite interdisciplinary in the way I approach this kind of question about professions. Anyway. So at the heart of my research, just say a little bit about, I suppose, why I am here and might have something useful. Heart of my research is questions of globalisation through the lens of the professions and professional services. And thinking in particular about two overlapping themes, which we've heard already quite a lot about this morning. Questions about knowledge, how knowledge is produced, circulated, mobilised, and all the questions that go with that, some of which were discussed in the last panel, and how that relates to mobility in the sense of mobility of knowledge, but also of professionals, of ideas, of power relations, etc. So I do that by looking at a range of different professional contexts, and the conspicuous absence is higher education. So there's something over there, architecture, accountancy, law, professionals working in these different sectors. But what I try to do, and you can't see this, I appreciate, on the slides, but what I try to do in my research is not so much just about kind of writing about what's going on in these sectors. It's really thinking about the power relations, the politics, and the impacts of globalisation. So thinking about how globalisation happens, the power and politics that underlies that, and the implications it has for particular places, for the global economy, and trying to tease out questions about what we can learn from looking at the professions about these wider issues. So it's those kind of wider issues of power, politics, and impact that I want to kind of reflect on a little bit and think about how some of the things we perhaps see in some of these other professional sectors might be relevant to higher education, might provide us with ways of thinking about some of the issues that have come up so far this morning. So what I'm going to do is make 3 kind of risky assumptions, and I won't ask you to challenge me on them yet, because otherwise the end of the talk is now. But we can debate these at the end, and I'm quite happy to be challenged on them and be told that my assumptions are completely wrong. But bear with me for the next 20 minutes or so with these assumptions. So I'm going to make the first assumption and suggest that we can think about parallels between higher education and professional services more broadly. And I'll say a little bit about why I think there are parallels in a moment. Assuming that one holds, if it doesn't, the rest of the talk certainly falls apart. I'm then going to talk about how higher education and professional services perhaps have similar experiences, but maybe, and it is a big maybe I think, but maybe there's a slight time lag, and maybe some of the things that we've seen in some of the other professional service sectors, higher education's experiencing now. So maybe there's some insights that we can look back at what happened in other spaces in perhaps the past decade, and we might learn and gain something in terms of the questions that higher education might be addressing today. Thirdly, kind of coming out of all that, I want to suggest that the geopolitics, the politics, the power relations of globalization are intriguing in the sense that I think the questions that are asked about, I'm going to talk about law in a little bit, for example, lawyers and law firms, are perhaps not that different to some of the questions about power and politics that we might ask about higher education. So they're my kind of risky assumptions, and what I'm kind of doing, my strange little image down there, I kind of took inspiration when I was trying to write this there's a series of articles in one journal. It's one that's behind a paywall that you have to pay lots of money for, unfortunately. But they call it peripheral vision. So this is where people come in and kind of look from the outside. And that's very much what I'm doing. Someone who doesn't research HE, we kind of bring a peripheral vision to kind of make these assumptions and try and read off and cross over between different domains. So, the starting point. Why do I think there could be something interesting to say, well, can we learn something from law, accountancy, architecture, for example, that might be relevant to higher education? There's lots of differences, of course, but I think there are some similarities, at least historically. So if we look at professions, professional services, like higher education, I think, at least historically, there was a common starting point which was very much about how academia was a profession and law, accountancy, whatever example you take, was a profession too. And they share some things in common. So I'm not going to go into a detailed kind of sociology of the professions, but that literature kind of focuses on a number of things, including that to operate, to work in these particular spaces, there's a closure system. So you have to have a particular set of credentials, and that makes it exclusive, the domain of the middle class, etc. Until recently, often there was a state monopoly in the sense that, for-profit organisations were not permitted, or not for-profit in the sense of an unregulated open market. Again, obviously, I'm not talking about any specific example here, but I'm just kind of throwing out ideas that we can perhaps start and see some of the connections that might exist in higher education to these sectors. Those that worked in a profession, at least, were seen as autonomous workers. They were meant to have freedom to practice their profession. And I'll come back to how, again, this might have been at least in the past. So professions, whether we think about the kind of work that I do on law or whatever it might be, or higher education, gives them a kind of some common kind of features that have implications in terms of how globalization happens or how globalization changes a sector. So I'll come back to that. What are they as a service, if we want to call them a service? Well, professions are knowledge-based. I hope that we probably agree that higher education is knowledge-based. Accountancy, architecture, the whole idea is that it's knowledge workers and using their expertise. That's what's the foundation of the service. What they provide, I won't use the word client, but what they provide to those who consume the service is partly experiential. It's very hard to value and assess because it's based on the kind of value added from interacting with these knowledge workers. And reputation is therefore crucial for whoever provides services. So whether it's an accountancy firm or a higher education institution, because of the often hard to assess nature of the beast, although the league tables suggest it's very easy to assess it, reputation matters. So These are my kind of attempts to kind of think about parallels in terms of the professions, services, but also in terms of globalization, how globalization happens. So I could apply this to a law firm, an accountancy firm, but I think maybe it could be applied to HE as well. So there's different modes of being global. So there's global professionals, people that travel and themselves are global, but then there are global organizations. And in a moment, I want to take a particular turn towards thinking about professions, organizations, and globalization, and think about the links between them. Particularly as, and I think this was mentioned in one of the discussions earlier, as when we think about globalization today, when we think about a higher education institution such as this, or a for-profit provider, we have to think about them in many ways as kind of business organizations. So there's various forms of globalization which can be a trade-based model, students coming here, people coming to London to buy law services. But there's, of course, been the development of the kind of in situ, branch camp, overseas office kind of model. Thirdly, there's a kind of highly regulated dimension to this. So all of this takes place under high degrees of regulation that influences what's possible and what can happen. So that's a kind of starting point that says, well, why would we think there are parallels? And what I want to kind of try and explore is how these particular features have shaped how globalization has happened in some of other professional sectors, but also raise a whole series of interesting questions that have been grappled with, and I'm going to use the case of law, over perhaps the past 10 to 15 years, that we could debate about whether this is happening now in higher education, whether it's relevant in the future, or whether it's already happened. Taking that these things are common and in various ways shape globalization, but are also impacted upon by globalization. So, to make that kind of shift towards organizations and the organization of globalization, I just want to quickly go through a kind of a parallel example of law and law firms and legal professionals. And I'm going to do this really quickly just to kind of paint the picture, because it's the kind of the implications, the story at the end I want to get to. But just provide a bit of context about how in a different sector globalization has happened and how it's raised a series of questions and challenges that we might debate. So, you probably won't be a surprise for you to hear, and detail is really not that important, but there are a whole series of large now global law firms that take the practice of being a legal professional and put it into the global stage in various ways. It's particularly interesting. And I suppose we could crudely cut up that story into three phases that recognises, first of all, of course, when we talk about globalisation today, we have to talk about history. And I think on the panel earlier, somebody suggested, you know, what's missing? Well, where's the historians? Where's the history of all of this? So clearly, law and globalisation has a history. We can think about the role of lawyers in empire, for example, whether it's in Asia, in Africa. So everything that happens today in terms of globalisation comes with a history that affects its implications. And when we think about law as a global profession today, really it's nothing new in many ways, because there's been lawyers mobile, trotting around the world, selling their services for centuries, just like academics have been mobile for centuries. But as I'll come back to in a moment, that history does matter, and thinking about it kind of chronologically is important for some of the questions we ask. We could then kind of say there's a second stage, which was where it moved from this kind of, I suppose, contemporary globalization, if you can call it that, the kind of late 20th century, early 21st century stage, where law very much became an export as a product itself, but also law as a service became something that you could trade. So we saw the rise of large law firms trying to sell legal services. So it was no longer just about individual professionals, it became an organizational thing, firms trying to sell legal services around the world. So we get international legal systems, but we also get organizations setting up offices, looking for new markets, new opportunities, coordinating the process. Then, most recently, we can talk about the rise of a kind of transnational system, a transnational regime. Scott calls it professionals becoming lords of the dance for the global economy, where we see organizations seeking to almost move beyond being an English, French, German professional organisation to be a transnational organisation. Whether that means to be globally significant, as our Vice-Chancellor said this morning, I'm not sure. But we see a slightly different stage. It's no longer just about globalizing, it's about becoming part of a transnational space. Now, that's a very short version of a long story, clearly. What I'm interested in, though, is the kind of implications and questions it kind of opens up that may have some parallels to what we've been talking about here today. So the first and the third I want to kind of connect together, and this is about politics and power. So the fact that globalization has a history clearly imbues it with a whole set of politics. And the fact that in the current moment, organizations are seeking to engage in forms of world organization in various ways we might call it, means it has all kinds of geopolitical ramifications. So in a moment I want to kind of come back to 1 and 3 together and think about these kind of questions that the panel ended with, really, the last panel, about, well, what is globalization today? What are the kind of perhaps difficult questions we need to ask about it, and why would we ask them? The second implication in the middle is about this idea that the approach to globalization has evolved. It comes out in this story here. It's, I'm sure, true for higher education. So I want to just turn to that question first and just throw out a few thoughts about why that evolution of the approach might matter, and how it might, again, open up a series of areas for debate. So, again, moving quite quickly, happy to talk more about this in questions if we want to. If we take that kind of chronological story that I took there on the previous slide, and look specifically at the organizations involved. So I talked about that turn towards organizations, law firms in this case, but organizations being more crucial in globalization. We can see kind of, I suppose, 3 stages in the story of what was happening in those organizations. And be interesting to debate about, and I'm going to suggest there might be some parallels to higher education. So after the stage of the individual professionals being global, we see the rise of these organizations, but first of all, if we look at English law firms, almost setting up outposts. So wanting to repeat what they do in England in other places around the world. And sending lawyers from England to those outposts to do that work. And the literature talks about this as a kind of multinationally fragmented model. You spot an opportunity, you set up an office, you send somebody to exploit it. As that strategy evolved over time, the process became much more coordinated. So again, I'm compressing and simplifying here for the sake of today, but we can talk about how after that initial kind of outpost strategy, it suddenly became about actually becoming much more embedded in the different places around the world the firms were seeking to, in inverted commas, exploit. And I'll come back to how we might talk about exploit later. So it involves starting to set up joint ventures, not just replicating what you do in England around the world. It became about not just sending people to another country for a period of time, but relocating professionals to embed them into these new markets, new countries that they were trying to exploit. And as part of that, it became much more about coordinating the process. So this was no longer a kind of sideline to the business. This was no longer something individuals kind of drove as part of their career. This became a coordinated process. And it moved from being a professional partnership, a professional activity, into being a managed professional business of globalization. And this perhaps comes back to some of the things that we heard in some of the first videos this morning and some of the debates about what is this thing we call globalization. Now this matters because for professionals, for those working in these organizations, it fundamentally changes what being global means. It's not just about part of an individual's practice, career path. It's become a business objective. So this is a quote from a paper about accountancy firms and law firms. Be interesting to see if we see anyone sees any parallels to higher education. But the organisation becomes seen as a business, and good business activities are profitable. A partner, so that's like a tenured member of staff in a higher education, I guess, is someone who's a team player. He trusts the leadership. Other words and phrases appear in their interpretive schema, including productivity, client service, competition, marketing, and growth strategies. That was a transition that happened in the 90s in in these professional service firms as globalization became an organizational strategy, not a part of a professional's kind of practice. So we've got this first stage, which is kind of idiosyncratic, replicating what we do in England around the world for English firms. We've got this second, more coordinated stage that has an impact on what the actual profession is itself and what it means to be a professional. The third stage is kind of a step on where organizations seek what sometimes they call transnational integration. So this is the final stage where we're no longer an English law firm, an American law firm. We're now a transnational organization. We're a group of professionals that where you're based, where you work, where you grew up has no relevance. We work as a single entity around the world. So it's not the main site, head office and other places. It's a single transnational organization. So a fundamental switch or ambition change in terms of what globalization is that follows that shift towards it becoming an organizational strategy. So that's a very short and potted history, but what I want to do and get to in the last 10 minutes really, I promised only to take half an hour so we could either have more discussion or early lunch. What I want to get to is the questions I think that really opens up, and the questions that kind of transition in other professional sectors has opened up that might be interesting for the debate today. So in summary, what we've got is a globalization as a process, having a history, organizations becoming more significant, arguably in most professional sectors, English and US being the experimenters, or we might call it pioneering in a more kind of loaded sense. We've got transformations going on in the professions, in the sectors themselves. So this move towards a more business orientation around globalization, this move from different models of outposts to integration to transnational form. And when I was kind of trying to write this and starting to think through the ideas, Janja pointed out this diagram to me. And I started to think maybe there are some connections. It gave me a little bit of sense of security, but could be wrong. When I started to look, I started to see similar kinds of, you can't see this at all, can you? But basically what this shows is the different modes, different organization of globalization in HE. And there seems to be potentially some parallels here. Now, I've talked about 3 stages. Some think, argued that firms, law firms, other professional firms went through these 3 stages. Perhaps being provocative, I might say, perhaps is higher education in stage 2 at the moment and about to or trying to move to stage 3? That's my provocative suggestion we could debate. Now, why I suggest that is because when we look at what's happened in these other professional sectors, the move to from stage 2 to stage 3 has opened up a whole series of questions about the implications of politics of this globalization kind of journey and transformations. So that's where I want to kind of end for the last 10 minutes. And so it's around these kind of geopolitical questions. And as the last panel ended, this discussion about, well, is globalization a form of neocolonialism in some sense? Who's globalizing, for what purposes, with what ends, and with what impacts? Because if we look at the case of law or accountancy or others, there's certainly a debate about the kind of neocolonial tendencies of these professions and the geopolitics of what they're doing through globalization. And I want to draw out 3 strands of the debate around that, again, to kind of, I suppose, provide some food for further debate. So I want to talk about mobility, knowledge mobility in particular, and when we look at that through a kind of post-colonial lens, what issues we start to see. The kind of what in the professional service firm we talk about intra-firm relationships, but the relationships between different actors in different places in globalization. And then thirdly, hybridity, this idea about, well, what actually is globalization producing? And what would a hybrid globalization look like? So these 3 things for the last 10 minutes. So mobility and knowledge mobility. So to think about how knowledge is produced, how it moves, how professionals move, we have to really remember that history. That as soon as professionals are mobile, that as soon as knowledge is produced in particular places and through the globalization of higher education or the law or whatever it is, we try in some sense to reproduce or mobilize that knowledge. We have to recognize, as Komarov and Komarov talk about, the fact that the colonial past reaches into the present. We can't think about that process as simply a technocratic kind of problem-solving approach, and I think some people commented on some of the kind of making the best decisions kind of language we heard in some of the first videos. So if we are, whether it's through research, whether it's through teaching, engaging in some form of knowledge mobility, whether we're opening up campuses around the world, whether we're writing journal articles, whatever it might be, there's a need to recognise, as Frenkel kind of highlights, the fact that transfer of abstract, practical, technological, or any other kind of knowledge is not a neutral instrument that represents reality or signifies an objective or most efficient mode of conduct. We need to think about what the implications are when we recognise that, because in these other professional service firms, what we saw as firms sought to move between stage 2 and 3, so from coordinated to truly transnational kind of operation, there was intense resistance and growing resistance to what they were doing. Resistance because it became clear in many places that this transfer of knowledge, this attempt to create this kind of new hegemonic kind of system, had all kinds of implications for the different countries, different professional groups, different consumers of the services around the world. And it raises a question about how easy it is to actually be truly transnational and to really take account of these questions, as at the end of the last panel were being debated. It raises these questions partly because of the fundamental starting point about that kind of post-colonial perspective on the issue, but also because of a number of other layers of problematic that has emerged as we've looked at what's been going on in the past decade or so in these other professional service sectors. So as I said earlier, we would, in that literature, we might talk about intra-firm relations or relationships between the different places around the world, so the different offices or the different sites around the world. And the idea that in this truly transnational form, it would be a collaborative, mutually respectful and non-hierarchical kind of set of relations. So this isn't head office and head subsidiary. This isn't, dare I say, main campus and branch campus or whatever it might be. But it's the research has shown that actually getting beyond those kind of relations is incredibly difficult, and thinking through how to be global without engaging in a form of neocolonialism is incredibly difficult. So this is just a quote about a consultancy firm, but I don't know. I'll read it, and could we say this about, dare I say, Lancaster and its campuses around the world? I probably can't, can I? But Vice Chancellor's not, he might be listening, mightn't he? Sorry. I don't know. It's a question, it wasn't a statement. Many of the smaller offices around the world were seen as less developed and far less important than the UK, and other large offices in terms of their contributions to the success of the firm. Their world was already pre-structured as a post-colonial hierarchy that justified the cultural and economic dominance of the larger offices based in the Western nations, and prevented them from perceiving of any problems with the inequalities and differences on which this dominance depended and which were reproduced by it. It's a question for debate, but the possibilities of kind of restructuring relations between different parts of the world as you kind of globalize and do it in a much more coordinated fashion, and how you reimagine the relationships that underlie that is not, I don't think, something that the literature on other sectors has an answer for, but it's something that has been debated quite intensely, and I'm sure is debated in HE. But it's perhaps where it gets us to in terms of the final question, in terms of hybridity, that perhaps is most useful, in terms of asking the question about what is a hybrid, transnational, global, insert law, profession, accountancy, HE sector. So Lumber suggests hybridity, the intersection of ideas and institutions, knowledge and power. But there are competing interpretations of what that actually means in terms of what this hybrid form that avoids neo-colonial tendencies actually could involve. So is it about the redefinition of existing modes of thinking? So is this about taking the way things are done and adapting them, reinterpreting them around the world? Or is this about actually, as someone hinted at the end of the last panel, about using the very thing, the higher education institution, the law firm, the legal practice, as a mode of resistance in itself? So repurposing that and using it to resist and putting it to work for the interests, the needs of different communities in different places around the world? Or is it about producing something completely new and saying, let's stop thinking about the world and using the current theories, the current approaches we have, which is probably easier for social scientists and chemists, as we heard at the last panel, but do we actually theorize away from the West? So how do we re-theorize away from the West without our models being the starting point for how we do law, HE, or whatever it might be? And these three different models and the proponents of each one of kind of, are I suppose, the centre of debate. And it's interesting perhaps to reflect about how these kind of ideas of hybridity could be relevant to the current and the future of higher education. So I've suggested that got kind of stages of globalisation with a history and a kind of series of developments have implications. Provocatively, that maybe HE is a little bit behind some of these other professional sectors and there might be some lessons, and if there are, these are the kinds of questions that we would want to think about. I'm not going to spend long on this, but what I would say is I definitely wouldn't recommend any of these other sectors as the solution, because I think their response has probably been to reproduce neo-colonial relations in various ways. So I'm not going to dwell on that for too long because we probably don't want to take lessons from, or we could take lessons of what we shouldn't do. But in some senses, these firms have tried to seek to maintain their dominance in the global economy by reproducing these power relations rather than moving beyond them. And I guess a question would be, could HE do something different? So, to conclude, I started with 3 risky assumptions. And we can take them apart now because I've finished. So there's something that we might learn from other professional sectors that's relevant to higher education. So I argued that the starting point, at least, have some commonality in terms of what is a profession, what are knowledge-based services, and what is doing globalisation. So then I went on to argue that maybe there's lessons that we can learn from these other professional service sectors that are relevant to HE, and maybe the kind of temporal dimension to that is higher education at a different stage in its globalisation. Maybe it's in front of the others, right? Something we can debate. But ended with the argument that whatever we think about the previous 2 points, that we perhaps should recognise that there's a geopolitics to all of this, and that actually that fundamentally structures everything that happens, the role of the organisations, the nature of the knowledge, the everyday practice. And we need to think about those challenges, reflect on them, and again, think about, is there anything we can learn from that kind of debate about hybridity in these other sectors that could be relevant to higher education? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So.
Okay, well, thank you, James, for this fascinating talk. I was quite intrigued at first when I heard you were going to compare global law firms with higher education, but I think your talk has really clarified why it makes sense. And there are indeed interesting parallels that you have explained. I would think, though, that maybe it's not so much to do with the morphology of the institutions or the nature of what they do, of the product they sell, but perhaps because they are all affected by tensions that are inherent to globalization processes and how uneven those processes are and what power struggles pervade them and the historical, the role of history in that as well. But in any case, it's really important, I think, to examine these because globalization is not a stateless, disembodied force, and it's, if we want to demystify it and understand it, it's really a starting point, an important starting point to look at how it's managed and produced by organizations and individuals. So you talk there specifically about how law firms established a physical presence overseas. And I guess the closest internationalizing activity of higher education would be the establishment of campus branches. It's probably fair to say that global law firms are corporations and that they're motivated by profit, perhaps, and prestige, but profit above all. And I think there's an assumption that universities are also motivated by commercial interests when they establish campus branches. Now, there are some differences, and I think that the most obvious is that, in fact, for universities, establishing an overseas campus is quite a risky endeavor. Financially, it doesn't work always. And it's not that lucrative. It requires a lot of resources. It's not, in general, a priority strategy. And there was that survey by the EAIE 2 years ago, where university leaders were asked to actually rank their priorities in relation to internationalization. And there was a set of 15 activities, and campus branches was really actually at the lowest level. Many universities cannot actually afford it. And there's also now, I think, an increasing risk in the sense that you have some universities in Asia and other places that are rising in the rankings. So maybe it doesn't make that much sense to have UK universities abroad. They could lose some appeal locally in relation to their competitors there. So what motivates universities in this particular type of activity is actually prestige. It's to increase their brand footprint, and they're hoping for long-term reputational benefits. But it's actually quite a risky strategy. So maybe there's a difference there between the kind of logic used by universities and that of global law firms. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can speak to that. The obvious difference, and I think we all know that, is that higher education institutions cannot behave like corporations. They're complex organizations, they have other missions, other goals, other loyalties, and in relation to internationalization, there are all sorts of academic, cultural, social, political objectives as well that maybe do not concern global law firms as much, or maybe they do. They're also subject to national regulations. They cannot change they cannot charge, actually, the fees that they want to charge, generally. They're limited in that in many places. And most of them as well, in relation to the overseas campuses, they rely on being invited by the host country. So there's the business strategy, but it's also really dependent on national legislation in the sending country and in the host country as well. Because a lot of branches were established in countries that had that specific policy to host international campuses in Qatar, Singapore, and so on. So maybe the more, I'm just guessing, maybe I'm wrong, so you can tell me later, but maybe they're more constrained by states and national regulations in the sense in how they can expand their activities. And I think maybe the main difference perhaps has to do with the professionals in them, in the legal professions and in academia. So in a sense, there are similarities. There are professionals, as you explained. They have their own disciplinary identities that transcend institutions. So there's some sort of collegial identity, disciplinary identity that connects them beyond the local and beyond the institution. And I think that's true for both professions. And in both cases, as you explained, the kind of rise of performance measures and new public management and so forth has changed that a little bit. But in universities, there are many different categories of employees. And I'm assuming, again, perhaps wrongly, that in global law firms, most employees have a legal training background and they're lawyers or solicitors of some kind. But in universities, well, you have the teaching staff, the research staff, technical staff, administration staff, catering staff, and so forth. So there's no real homogeneity and very different frames of references, very different orientations and professional identities actually within university staff. And in this sense as well, there are different rationales for internationalization and are perceived differently and in many cases contested by the employees of the university as well. So, for example, and I think that's what we've been talking about this morning a lot, there's the kind of imaginary ethos of internationalization and then the commercial realities And the differences between the two mean that academic staff are positioned differently in relation to that. That's divided there. So maybe the sense of working for the firm, being a partner in the firm, and following those strategic goals are slightly different or don't play out in the same way in academia. And also the academic profession itself is segmented. And we have now, and it's Simon Bay who wrote actually about that, the star academic market, which is an international market. So that's quite interesting. Maybe there's a parallel with global law firms as well. You do have some star academics who can negotiate their salaries, who can move across countries, who can be actually bought, who can negotiate their own price and can be bought by universities across the world. And these are very mobile. Now you also have permanent staff who I think tend to be more attached to the institution and not as mobile. And then finally, kind of precarious layer of staff who are encouraged to cross borders, but who are not in a position to negotiate their salary at all. So I was wondering if with globalization, the same was happening in the legal profession, if there was a change in the status of those people under those different forces. And as you explained, there was a closure system in place, and there still is in many countries. So in a sense, you cannot access certain courses in law or medicine because the numbers are restricted so that the fee levels can be maintained, the social status of those professions can be maintained. It's not so much the case in academia anymore. But my question here is, how is globalization changing that? How is it changing the ability of individuals trained as solicitors to maintain a social status for the profession? Is it affecting it? Is it actually stratifying the profession in different ways? And we could also wonder, how is that playing out in other professions? I'm thinking of journalists, for example, NGO workers who are also internationalizing a lot. So I found as well that a lot of the dilemmas and the questions you raised resonated a lot with similar question in higher education. There's the idea of the kind of dominant model, the Anglo-Saxon model, and I think that's quite true still in the area of higher education. And the world-class university model that everybody is aspiring to is very much an Anglo-Saxon model. There's the idea as well that the branches, the overseas branches, usually don't have the same status. And it's not really a reproduction of what is done in the core country in the sense that, the humanities usually are not exported, but it's more like what can be sold that is exported. It's not necessarily the core staff that is exported as well. So it's generally kind of lower status. And the resources invested are not the same. The staff-student ratio would be very different in the overseas branches generally. There are questions as well about knowledge, and I think in higher education there are many questions about how to meaningfully internationalize the curriculum and make it really transnational. I'm not sure if that's really a concern for global law firms, but if it were, how could they do that? How could they do that with law? And what would a global transnational law firm look like? In the same sense as we can ask ourselves, what would a truly, transnational university be like? And there are also other questions in relation to professional standards, professional ethics, and all those regulations at global levels. And we can ask about that in relation to the academic profession as well as the legal professions. And I wonder as well, I'm nearly finished there, but are those legal professionals who work in global law firms, is there a specific educational pathway to get there? Are they socialized differently compared to those who will work at national level with national law? Are there new training courses emerging? And how does that affect the nature of legal knowledge as it is taught at university level or maybe other higher education institutions training those people? So how is that? How is that affecting knowledge? And I think really I'll finish on that question again, which is a question for everyone, not just for James, but what would a truly ethically transnational insert global law firm or university look like? And I think that's something that we can talk about a lot more. So that's it.
Thank you, Aline. James, would you like to address some of the issues she raised?
I shall try, yes. There's a lot there. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. You won't be surprised to hear me say that I think there's less differences than perhaps you might think, but you'd expect me to say that. But let me kind of go through it a bit. I'm not going to go into all the empirical detail, but I think the reason I kind of spot the differences and the similarities is that the things you alluded to about risk of globalizing, it being potentially a peripheral kind of, not necessarily interest, but on the periphery of the strategy, as it were, not profitable, an investment for the future, all about prestige and reputation. It's actually pretty much the same for most of these firms. Most of them are still dominated by wherever they were born, so England, the USA, wherever it is. And many of their officers overseas don't make a profit, and they're there simply as a reputational thing and a longer-term bank. And that's not the case in every, there's some officers would be very profitable, but it's very much, there are similar kind of parallels. So that's kind of at the level of empirical detail, but I think what intrigues me most about the parallels is that switch that you described in terms of the nature of the workforce, the identity of the professional, and whether the academic is different to the lawyer, and whether the academic has, and the institutions also have a particular political, social, and kind of motivation that might make them different. Because yes, they are different in many ways, but actually that quote that I kind of put up came from a very big debate kind of 20 years ago about how the legal profession wasn't the legal profession anymore because it had become a business and it had become commercial. And the kind of fiduciary, public interest responsibilities of the lawyer have been kind of, at worst, subverted, or if not, squeezed by these new commercial imperatives. And hence you get the words like profitability marketing and things like that. And I think what's most interesting, and hopefully we're not going this way in higher education, is, but if you go to those firms that were being looked at 20 years ago and these kind of things being written about, look what's happening, many of those historical kind of assumptions have almost disappeared, and lawyers now are business people, and they're there to serve the interests of the firm and to deploy the strategy of the firm by practicing law. And they've lost their connection. They haven't lost their connection to the profession. They're still much connected to their profession, but it's not in the way that historically we would have understood it, and perhaps in higher education how we think about academics and their motivation. Now, the interesting question is as I think we all recognise the words of marketing, strategy, profitability, and these kinds of things. How do we maintain in higher education what's the trajectory as for-profit providers, as the bottom line becomes more and more central in everything that we do. It seems to in my day-to-day kind of activity, at least anyway. What parallels are there? What are there lessons there that we perhaps should learn about the risks that could happen? So today there are differences, but when we look at that kind of time lag, we perhaps see that there is. And that's why I provocatively said, "Oh, is HE at stage 2 and these firms slightly further down the road?" So yes, there are some different, but I think there are at least lessons and parallels. But as I say, you would expect me to say that. The second one, you raised a couple of questions about kind of. You talked a little bit about the status of lawyers and how it might be changing as a result of globalisation. And you said at the end there about educational pathways and who gets to be certain kinds of lawyers. And I think there's linking those together in terms of kind of questions of education and the professions, but also regulation. I think there's a couple of interesting kind of observations at least we could make. So the first one is that in some ways, in the legal profession at least, what globalisation has done is to dissolve some of those closure boundaries that previously existed. Partly because of things like the EU Service Directive, the World Trade Organization, its Mode 4, General Agreement on Trade in Services, which says you're not allowed to have those boundaries anymore. So actually, somebody can come from Germany, France, or wherever it is and be a lawyer in England after doing an exam, basically. You don't need to go through all the education. So how does the kind of the regulation of globalization have an implication for all these things? I think is, again, an interesting question, because this idea that you can tightly police a sector at the national level is, you know, certainly in these other professional services has been eroded, and you know, I guess similar things are happening in higher education. Who gets to education and the link to who gets to into these professions? So some would argue they become much more meritocratic, and it's many more people are now in the professions, and I guess there are many more people employed in higher education, but there's certainly a stratification, and it pretty much doesn't look that different in many of these organisations to what it looked 30, 40 years ago, that where you go to university, your family background has a significant influence on the people that get into certain parts of the sector. And again, how that applies to HE, which we could debate. Your final point, the dominance of the Anglo-Saxon model. And you kind of raised the question about, you know, what would a truly transnational kind of higher educational knowledge look like? I don't have the answer, unfortunately. We could perhaps debate that. But I suppose again, there are parallels here, and what we could say is that I think it's important to recognise that the questions you asked said, well, you know, you would ask about higher education. How do we make things relevant when we sell them, shall we say, elsewhere? How do we transform them? How do we produce a curriculum that is meaningful to different groups of students? Again, it's not that different to many of the questions that these firms would ask, because selling English law to the Chinese doesn't sound very logical in many ways. But that's still what firms have sought to do by adapting it to the needs of the Chinese. But that's not probably what we call a truly transnational kind of approach. That's selling our products elsewhere and making some tweaks around the edges. And I think what I was kind of pushing on a little bit towards the end was the suggestion that that's exactly what we need to get away from, is this idea that we just adapt what we do a little bit to make it work. It's about actually, if these organisations want to be truly transnational, I think they, you know, many recognise it but don't practice it. It's not about adapting; it's about producing something that collectively, through the whole range of communities around the world that we engage with. Now, that's not an easy thing to even begin to think about how you do it, but there's some of the kind of questions we might debate, I suppose. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We have about 8 to 10 minutes for questions, so please. Yeah. Okay, please.
I'll ask another question. Gareth Williams again, from UCL, Institute of Education. What struck me about the parallels, and this really take up a point of Aline's, I think, that the professions are much better defined than higher education. If you are setting up international law activities, you know what you're talking about. And it would be quite easy to say, that's none of our business. And I think two questions arise from that. Can you say that of higher education? And secondly, more importantly, in a way for this present discussion, you quoted several works in one of your slides which point to the development of internationalization in law from the empire model to a more open model. But they all seem to be concerned with single professions. Has anybody attempted to do an interpretation of the professions internationally generally, which would be the real analogy with higher education? Because it strikes me that law, medicine, engineering are actually very different in their international, how you go about having an international dimension to them.
Okay, thank you. James.
Okay, so yeah, your kind of first point about clarity about what is our business, that if you're a lawyer you know what you're selling, and I guess you're suggesting HE it's a bit more diverse, it's not as clearly defined as to what the product is. Yes, I think that's true. That would be a fair kind of differentiation. Although, again, one of the things that's happened with globalisation is that what actually these law firms provide you wouldn't necessarily recognise as being legal services. They look like pseudo consultancy, pseudo advisory, business advisory services that have a legal basis to them. So it's a bit like saying, as HE, we can provide consultancy with an academic basis, while law firms say we provide consultancy that has a legal basis. So to globalise, they've actually diversified as well. And I mean, if you go back to the whole Enron days and a decade ago, that was the basis of, you know, one of the issues of Enron was that their professional advisors weren't just doing professional advice. They were saying we're accountants that know how to tell you to structure your business as well. So I think there's, just like in that kind of entrepreneurial spirit of HE, kind of diversified what we can do, and it isn't just give a load of lectures to 18 to 21-year-olds or whatever it might be. I think these firms have done something similar. So I'm, you know, I guess I'm stuck now. I've backed myself into a corner, haven't I? To every time trying to draw the parallels, but I do think they're there. So sometimes I might just go, yeah, you're right. Yes, so no, so there wouldn't be a single story of all the different professions either, of medicine, engineering. They have slightly different approaches. Yes, so maybe that's one I would concede that they are different. So why would you paint them all as a single story? But what I would say is that the engineers, the architects, not sure about medicine, law, accounting, all face these same questions about whether you call it neo-colonial or tendencies, in the sense of there's this Anglo-Saxon kind of dominance of this field, and the attempt to reproduce that around the world raises these kind of tricky questions. So different modalities, but perhaps similar, as Aline alluded to, perhaps similar kind of questions about globalization as a process itself and what it implies.
Thank you. Janja?
I have a comment and a question, really. So, comment first. Regarding universities, research now shows that universities have become very heterogeneous institutions, and at the same time they might work not for profit ways, and at the same time they might work in for-profit ways. And I'm talking about the traditional public universities. So, for example, they might serve their local environment and students and so on. In the ways that we tend to think about universities, and at the same time they are very entrepreneurial and profit-seeking in their other operations, often internationally, and also seeking to diversify their incomes nationally. So there are people working on how universities are actually seeking financial opportunities in foreign countries, branch campuses, franchising, and all of this. Now, this is very interesting because then this, if I continue thinking about this then brings me to the actually thinking about the balance between knowledge as open and global and so on, what was just mentioned before, versus universities as firms, or as, you know, if I can be a bit provocative, as organizations and in this sense institutions, which seems to me is a bit different if we talk about knowledge as open and global or university as a firm, really. So in this sense, James, this is a question now, when you said about how you can learn from your research in law firms and so on, how this is maintaining dominance by reproducing power relations. So my question here provocatively is, whose responsibility would be not to do this? And, you know, if now we think about universities and higher education, we again tend to have these romantic views, like was said at the previous panel as well, how international global is all good. So who is supposed to take care that universities are indeed contributing to the global social justice, development, and so on?
Thanks. Yeah, so yeah, kind of two things there. The first one, this idea, yeah, that in universities we see this kind of almost a for-profit arm, and then and I mean that's interesting because people have written about attempts to create either kind of compartmentalized kind of operating units almost within a single organization, because the logic of for-profit is very different to the logic of the pursuit of knowledge and the betterment of society. And it's often hard to reconcile those. And people have talked about the attempts to kind of compartmentalize those within a single firm or single higher education institution. Of course, the story is it's very hard to actually maintain them as coexisting and maintaining the two logics and this competition between them. And so I think that's often what potentially we might be seeing, and I think they see it in these, for example, law firms where pro bono work. So all lawyers are meant to do pro bono, which is free legal advice for the good of whether it's social justice or whatever it might be. How do you maintain that alongside the highly profit-seeking logic of the rest of the organisation, and how does doing pro bono work be maintained as legitimate, to ask you? So I think it is a really interesting question about what happens when these two competing logics coexist in an organisation and the problems that can cause. In terms of whose responsibility is it then? So you could say whose responsibility when they've got those competing logics is it to defend the kind of interest? I think this comes back to a little bit a comment that Aline made about the different makeups and the kind of the workforce almost, because exactly the same has happened in many ways in other professional services as happened in some parts of HE, that we've now got a segmented management cadre, shall we call them, that are no longer academics anymore, that are running the university, making decisions, doing the strategy and pursuing globalisation in some cases, and then the everyday academics that are doing what everyday academics do. And so there's a real challenge there about it should be everybody's responsibility, but again you've almost got two different groups with different logics, and so without creating a battle between them where you've got one fighting for one view of globalisation and another fighting for another, it's quite hard to think through how you reconcile those differences. So you want to answer the question, it's everybody's responsibility, but I'm not sure whether that's realistic about what we see. And I think yes, that's where there are again parallels in all other kinds of professional firms where the lawyers doing the work might not agree with the strategy of the firm, and historically 30 years ago they would have been able to challenge that. They would have challenged it through the partner council, where they wouldn't have signed off decisions. So I suppose the open question for everyone here is, through Senate, can you challenge the decisions that come from the strategizers, who might be working on a different logic? And because that's a similar kind of story. So it should be everybody's responsibility, but whether it is or not, I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers it or not. But.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions? Okay, we take these two questions and then we have to close. We are running over with time, so yeah, okay. Golo, please.
Just a quick one, really. How does private higher education fit into your comparison of law, legal services, and the globalization of higher education? And I understand is that actually it's private. I mean, if you look at global higher education, it is private providers mainly that are operating on a global level. These American universities are set up in various countries for these are for-profit companies, and they must have an underlying objective function that is then similar to a law firm. They want to expand to new markets and increase their profits in the end. Whereas a traditional university, I don't quite see where their objective function is a different one. So the Aline talked about these incentives to expand it could be a prestige project that is not so economic reasons can't be the main driver for that, at least at the moment. I don't know whether Brexit changes the rationale, and UK universities like them to offshore to the continent to secure funding and the EU students, but that's again determined by the market. Sorry, I wasn't so sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So can we have the second question and then he answers them both together?
Thanks, James. My question is, in a sense, you've been describing the professional services firms as obviously a major part of globalisation, but never really leading it or gaining from it in any great, because they just haven't been able to set up these enormous global firms where there is actual real economic activity taking place elsewhere. which obviously, to go one step further, is very, very different to manufacturing. So my question is, post 2008, over the last 10 years, globalisation, of course, has changed. Could you say anything about what globalisation, what's going on in a professional services firm? Does this tell us about the way in which globalisation is evolving more generally? Are they canaries in the coal mine in some way in terms of problems with this model of globalisation? How are they trying to evolve? What does that tell us about how globalisation itself may evolve?
Yeah. Okay, I'll be brief so as not to get in the way for lunch. Your point about for-profit providers, I mean, there's two ways. The easiest way to interpret that is they represent the new breed of pure for-profits in the professional services sector. And law's the best example again there. So in England, you can now have a law firm that's listed on the stock market that isn't run by lawyers, that is purely about just making profit, which is totally different to any of these other firms that have been around for years and started off as a partnership. And so you get these renegade, whatever you want to call them, that disrupt the sectors effectively and come in with very different logics, very different approaches. So I didn't really talk about those, but you've got those in the other professional sectors as well. And it creates two different groups effectively operating in the same space, and they take different approaches. And so there's, they kind of reflect that. It's kind of, the firms I talked about have been around for tens or hundreds of years and have done globalisation towards the end of their story. These other ones are born for profit, so it's kind of a similar kind of parallel. Your question, David, about post-2008. Yeah, I think there is a lesson here. I mean, these firms do gain from globalisation. They require globalisation to survive in some senses because many of their clients are the manufacturers you talked about or whatever. But the interesting thing is the post-2008 switch, which is partly related to this model of what is a true transnational, that it's not really, it's becoming increasingly untenable to just be an Anglo-Saxon institution trying to do things around the world, because the rise of Asia, the growth of the Asian economies relative to the stagnation elsewhere means that actually it's the firms emerging from those places that are becoming more and more significant. So we saw for the first time, to use the example of law again, a Chinese firm merge with an English firm. So a change in the kind of the power relations and the dynamics, which kind of fuel these questions about what does a truly transnational organisation look like. It's not so much in the future an organisation that's effectively come from England and the USA and managed to somehow adapt itself. It's one that actually has somehow moved beyond that. And I guess there might be some similar kind of interesting questions for HE here about not the complete dominance, but the preponderance for it to be US, European institutions globalizing. How does that work in the future as the centre of influence in higher education evolves in a similar way to what we've seen elsewhere? So, lunch.
Thank you very much to both speakers, and have lunch. Enjoy.